Have you ever really watched a pair of eyes? Not just glanced at them the way you might in passing on a busy street, but really watched, the way you might linger on a candle flame in a dark room, noticing how the light trembles and shifts, how the shadows move across the wax. If you let your mind drift back over the people you've seen in your life, the faces that have moved past you on buses and sidewalks and screens, you start to notice something quiet and remarkable, something so obvious that it almost disappears. The eyes are all, in some deep way, the same, and yet the way they sit in the face, the way the skin folds around them, the way the lids frail that dark, gleaming circle, that is astonishingly different from person to person, from region to region, from lineage to lineage. If you imagine a kind of slow-minus motion slideshow of faces, each one dissolving into the next, you might notice how some eyes seem a little more open, the upper lid curved in a particular way, the crease above it clearly marked, while others seem to wear a smoother curtain of skin, a soft fold that partially veils the inner corner, shaping the visible opening into something subtly different. You see some eyes that catch the light across a broad, exposed surface, and others that seem to look out from a slightly more shaded frame, as if wrapped in a thin, protective layer. That fold, that smooth band of skin near the inner corner of the eye, is what we call an epicanthic fold. You might carry it yourself. Perhaps you have seen it in the mirror your whole life without a name for it, only a feeling that your eyes looked a certain way, that other people's looked a little different. Or perhaps you do not have that fold, and you have grown up noticing it in classmates, in actors, in friends, a feature that your mind filed away under how some people look, without asking too loudly why. And yet, as you lie here, somewhere between waking and sleep, this is precisely the kind of question that can begin to tug gently at you, like a thread in a vast tapestry. Why should eyes, of all things, vary like this? Because underneath all that variation, the actual globe of the eye, the round, wet, astonishingly delicate organ that catches the light, is almost the same from one human to another. Within our species, the differences in the ball itself are very small. The remarkable diversity comes from the framework and the coverings, the lids, the folds of skin and muscle and fat, the bony rims of the skull around them, the setting of the jewel, not the jewel itself. And once you notice that, it becomes harder to treat it as mere ornament. If you look, really look, at the way eye shapes cluster in different parts of the world, you begin to see patterns. In some broad regions, most people you meet will share a certain style of eyelid, a certain common architecture around the eye, so common that, to the people who grow up there, it feels almost like the default. The way eyes are meant to look. In other places, you might barely see that particular fold at all, and another style, another configuration, dominates. You might think of Eastern Central Asia here, where the epicanthic fold is famously common, where the eyes often appear, to an outside observer, as if framed by a gentle, continuous line of lid with a less prominent crease. But that is only one of the stories, one of the most visible, the one that has perhaps been most written about, most drawn, most turned into symbols and stereotypes. And yet, the fold is not confined to one latitude or one culture, not locked to one single ancestral homeland. If you imagine a map of the world, not the political map with its sharp borders and colors, but a softer, more living one, where each region is shaded by the common shapes of eyes, you might see if you walked there for days and weeks. You would see that this feature, and variations of it, appear again and again, in distant and unexpected places, as if the same quiet design choice had been made, independently, several times over. That is already a kind of mystery. Because in the story of life, when you see the same trait appear in separate lineages, in separate corners of the world, your mind naturally asks what force is pushing in that direction. What wind is blowing the branches of the family tree into similar shapes? When you see, such astonishing variation in something as vital as the gateway to our sight. You feel, intuitively, that it must matter, that some deep current of survival and adaptation and chance has been moving through our ancestors to carve these differences into their faces. And here is where the question sharpens, becomes something you can hold, examine from different sides. Why did these eye shapes evolve? What was at stake? Was it a matter of cold wind and blinding snow, of harsh sunlight and thin air, of destined sand and glare, wearing at the delicate surface of the eye? Was it a matter of what our ancestors found attractive, the faces they chose to pair with, the traits they favored in their lovers and passed on to their children? Was it the blind, drifting hand of chance, pushing certain features to dominance in small, isolated groups, not because they were especially useful, but simply because they were there, in the right people, at the right time? And more than that, what is the adaptive significance, if any, of these differences? When you hear the words adaptive significance, your mind might jump to images of immediate utility, like a coat in winter or a shade in summer, something obviously helpful, something you can understand in a single sentence. But in the deep history of our species, adaptation is rarely that simple. Traits can do more than one job. Some may once have been important, then become less so, lingering like fossils in flesh. Some may have started by riding along with more crucial changes bundled in the same genetic package, becoming important only later in a different environment, under different cultural eyes. So when we look at the epicanthic fold, at the way the eyelid shapes vary so dramatically and yet so subtly, what are we really seeing? Are we seeing a shield against cold and wind, a small rearrangement of skin and soft tissue that protected fragile eyes in unforgiving climates, where icy air could sting and dehydrate, where snow turned the ground into a vast, reflective mirror? Are we seeing the imprint of high plateaus and open steppes, of blinding light and long winters? Or are we seeing something woven through with human preference, with desirability, with the quiet way people have always chosen partners who look, in some deep sense, like home? Are we seeing the echo of parental faces in the faces of the children they chose to have, of subtle biases in attraction that, over hundreds or thousands of generations, reshaped the very architecture of the face? Perhaps we are seeing both. Perhaps we are seeing both. Perhaps we are seeing more. Here is the thing you and I have to hold gently. As we enter into this story together, there is no single, simple driver for these features, especially not in East and Central Asia, where they have become so central to the way people imagine the regions look. There is no clean, one-sentence explanation that covers every angle, every population, every time period. Instead, we are faced with a weave of influences, a layered story that begins in ancient climates and ancient migrations, wins its way through random genetic events and harsh selection, and then threads itself through human culture, through ideas of beauty and difference and belonging. The question, then, is not only why did this evolve, but how many reasons might there be, and how do they fit together? To understand why this is such a profound mystery, it can help to think about the face as an archive. Your face, the one you know from mirrors and photographs, is not just a surface, not just a way for other people to recognize you. A living document, written not in ink, but in cartilage and bone and skin, carrying the signatures of thousands upon thousands of ancestors. When you blink, tiny muscles contract in patterns that were shaped by the lives of people long before you, people who endured weather and hunger and fear, who walked across plains and climbed mountains and waited out storms, people who loved and chose and had children, all the way back through millennia. When you close your eyes tonight, you are closing the lids that their choices built. Those epic and thick folds, those open creases, those subtle differences in how the eyelid lies over the eye, a part of that living archive. Once you see them that way, it becomes impossible to dismiss them as trivial, as mere appearance. They are fossils of survival. And yet, the fossils are frustratingly ambiguous. If you were to find a shell in a layer of ancient rock, you might be able to say, fairly quickly, that this animal burrowed or swam, that it filtered food from the water, or clamped down on prey. Its shape tells you, in an almost mechanical way, what it was for, what environment it fit into. But the human face is trickier. The same trait can serve several possible roles. A certain configuration might help just a bit in a harsh climate, but that benefit might be small, hard to measure, easily overshadowed by cultural or social effects. The trait might rise into prominence because it is linked, genetically, to something else that is more obviously useful, or it might drift through small populations like a rumor, becoming common simply because a few early ancestors happen to have many descendants. So, when scientists look at the diversity of eye shapes in humans, they see both the lure of an elegant story and the warning of complexity. It would be tempting, for example, to say, eyes with this kind of fold evolved in cold, windy environments for protection. And that is the whole explanation. It would be tidy, satisfying, easy to remember. But then you notice the same fold, or something much like it, in places that are not especially cold, or in populations who share a distant connection with people from harsh, icy regions, but who now live in very different climates. You notice that some groups who have lived for a long time in cold places do not commonly show that fold, while others do. The simple story begins to fray at the edges, and then you recognize another layer. The fold appears in infants across the world. Newborn humans, almost everywhere, carry a version of it. In many, it fades with growth, as the face lengthens, as tissues change. In others, it remains much more prominent into adulthood, a stable, inherited feature. Suddenly, the puzzle is not only about why a certain structure exists, but why it lingers in some lineages and recedes in others, why some ancestries preserve the infant minus, like fold, and others do not, what that might have meant in the environments where those lineages spent most of their deep past. You can feel, perhaps, even with your eyes closed now, the way the problem opens like a fan. When one spoke of that fan, you have the brute facts of survival harsh environments, where tiny advantages in protecting vision could make the difference between seeing and not seeing, between navigating the landscape and being blinded at crucial moments. On another spoke, you have the mathematics of genes moving through populations, of small groups, splitting off and carrying with them a particular combination of features which can then wax or wane with time and chance. On another, you have the strange, potent force of sexual selection, the way certain faces simply feel right or beautiful or desirable to people in a given culture, and how that feeling can reshape the population across generations. And then you have yet another spoke, the part we have not yet fully grasped, the combinations and interactions, the why this and not that, that still resists our understanding. So this is the landscape of the mystery you and I are stepping into together. At the center is a simple observations, exhibit remarkable variation in eye shape, especially in the presence and prominence of the epicanthic fold. Spread around that center are many possible explanations, none of them alone sufficient to explain everything we see, especially in the case of Eastern Central Asia, where the trait is not only common, but deeply woven into how the world imagines those regions' people. And hovering above it all is the guiding question, why did these traits evolve, and what do they mean, if anything, for survival? As you let your breathing slow, you might picture, for a moment, a person living tens of thousands of years ago, somewhere in what would one day be called Asia. The wind is strong, the air is dry and biting, the sky is a hawk, paylock. They narrow their eyes as they walk, their lids a little more closed than yours might be on a mild day, the skin around the eye shaped in a way that their parents and grandparents share. Did that small difference help, even a little? Did a certain configuration of liden fold shield their eyes from freezing wind or blinding glare just enough that they could keep hunting, keep walking, keep finding their way home, where others might have struggled? It is possible. It is one of the ideas that researchers turn over in their minds like a stone in the hand, feeling for grooves and patterns. Or perhaps the most important thing about that person's eye shape was not the climate at all, but the faces they saw around the firelight, the faces they saw in love with, the children they had, the way their community saw itself. Perhaps the fold marked shared ancestry, a feeling of us and unconscious, quiet cue that shaped who paired with whom, and so who passed on which version of the eyelid into the next generation. And perhaps, over time, what began as a small difference, hardly noticeable, grew as those choices repeated, like a melody becoming more distinct with each repetition. The mystery only deepens when you consider that, across the world, similar folds have appeared in populations that, on the surface, seem very distant, separated by oceans and mountains, and long histories. That is the whisper of convergent evolution, when similar solutions arise in different lineages, driven by similar pressures or by the same constraints in how bodies can change. But again, we have to be careful, you and I. It is easy to see similarity and assume identical causes. It is easy to say, wherever we find this fold, the environment must have been the same, or wherever we find this shape, it must be because of this one reason. Reality is often less neat. Different lineages can arrive at similar anatomical outcomes by different genetic roots, under different circumstances, even with slightly different functions. A fold of skin near the eye may do somewhat similar work into places, or it may be more important in one context than in another. It may matter a great deal for protection in one climate, and much less in another, where it persists mostly because it is part of the shared heritage of a group, or because it is tied to other traits that are under stronger selection. In this way, the epicanthic fold and the broader constellation of eye shapes become not just a biological puzzle, but a story about how evolution rarely writes in simple lines. It layers, it revises, it borrows phrases. It lets some words persist long after their original context has changed, because they have become part of a larger, interwoven paragraph. When we focus more narrowly on East and Central Asia, the mystery gains yet more texture. In that vast region, over long stretches of time, people have lived in environments that can be harsh and extreme. Glacial winds sweeping across open land, winters that strip the air of moisture, high windswept plateaus where the sun's glare is sharpened by thin air and reflective snow. These are places where the eyes are under constant assault, where the world itself seems to push at that delicate film of tears covering the cornea, trying to dry it, freeze it, overwhelm it. It is here that the common presence of the epic and thick fold and other related eye-minus shape traits invite specific, pointed questions. Did these features arise as direct responses to those conditions, part of a suite of adaptations that helped people see and survive in such landscapes? Or did they emerge in populations who happened, by chance, to find themselves in those environments, and then become more common because of a combination of slight protective effects and social dynamics? Were they originally tied to something else entirely? Another trait influencing hair or skin or sweat, that proved useful in those climates, with changes in the eyelid simply along for the ride? Scientists look at the high prevalence of certain and minus shape patterns in East and Central Asian populations, and at their echoes in other parts of the world, and they see evidence of strong evolutionary forces at work. When a trait becomes that common in a large population, it suggests that, at some point in its history, there was a powerful push, a reason for its rise, whether that reason was environmental, social, or genetic. And yet, pinning down that reason, or rather, those reasons, is not straightforward. For one thing, Evolution operates in deep time. The conditions under which a trait first expanded through a population may be very different from the conditions that population experiences now. Cold, glacial periods come and go. Groups migrate. Valleys that were once refuges become roots. A trait that once offered a small advantage may later be mostly neutral, simply carried forward because there is no strong pressure to remove it. For another, knowing that a trait spreads does not immediately tell you why. The same pattern in genetic data can be produced by strong natural selection on a trait, by certain kinds of demographic events, like a small group splitting off and growing rapidly, or by a mix of both. To disentangle these, researchers have to combine many lines of evidence where the trait is found, how common it is, how it occurs with other traits, what we know about the ancient climates and migrations in the region. Even then, some questions remain open, not because we lack data entirely, but because living humans are complex systems shaped by overlapping histories. And here is where your own presence in this story matters. Because you, lying here, is perhaps starting to feel heavy, belong to one branch or another of that intricate family tree. You make Aryan epic and thick fold yourself. You may not. Maybe your family is from East Asia, or Central Asia, or from another part of the world where this trait appears. Maybe your ancestry lies mostly in regions where a different eye shape is more common. Or maybe you are the living meeting point of several lineages, your eyelids carrying a combination of features that tell a story of mixing and convergence all their own. Whatever the case, the shape of your eyes, the way the skin gathers and smooths around them, is not random. It is the current state of a long, ongoing experiment in how a single species can adapt, diversify, and drift across the face of the planet. The mystery we're exploring is, in a very real sense, the mystery of how your face came to be as it is. This is why the question of adaptive significance matters, even beyond scientific curiosity. To ask what, if anything, a trait was for in the context of evolution is to ask, what did my ancestors face? What challenges did they meet? What environments did they endure so that I could be here, in this moment, breathing and thinking and listening? But it is also important to recognize the limits of such questions. Not every trait has a neat purpose, something you can reduce to a simple function, like a tool in a box. In evolutionary terms, a feature might persist because it is slightly helpful, because it is neutral but linked to something else that is helpful, or because it happens to have become common by genetic drift and there is no strong reason to push it out. So when we speak of adaptive significance for eye shapes, and epic and thick folds, we are not necessarily claiming that each variation is a perfectly engineered solution to a problem. We are asking where and how those shapes might have influenced the survival and reproduction of the people who first carried them, how they might have affected the odds, even slightly, in particular places and times, and in Eastern Central Asia, in those ancient climates, in those vast, open lands, those odds would have been no small matter. You can almost feel it if you close your eyes and imagine the scene of pale, low sun glancing off snow-covered ground, a freezing wind cutting across an exposed face, the need to keep moving, to keep watching the terrain, to notice subtle changes in texture that might be nice or thin ground or the faint track of prey. In such a world, every tiny reduction in glare, every small decrease in the rate at which the thin film of tears evaporates from the eye's surface might help. It might not guarantee survival, but it might tilt the balance, however slightly, toward those who carried certain anatomical quirks in their eyelids. But even if that is part of the story, it cannot be the whole of it, because if climate alone dictated our shape, we would expect the same configurations to appear in every cold, windy place, and to vanish in every mild one. That is not what we see, which brings us back again to the idea that the evolutionary drivers for these features are not singular. Perhaps, in some lineages, the fold and related eye shapes, started to become common because of a modest protective effect in a specific environment. Perhaps, in others, the same or similar features emerged primarily because of genetic drift in small, isolated groups. Perhaps, in yet others, subtle preferences in mate choice reinforced these traits, turning them into visible markers of group identity, of us and our people, which then fed back into whom arid whom, and which features became more common over long periods of time. These forces could overlap, reinforce each other, or act in different directions. A trait that rose because of one kind of selection might later be maintained by cultural patterns. A feature that began by chance might later acquire some environmental importance as people moved into new habitats. When you consider all this, the question of why these eyes becomes much more than a single puzzle. It becomes a lens through which to view the interplay of nature and chance and human choice. And it becomes, in its own way, a kind of mirror, reflecting back on the stories people have told about each other based on appearance. Because for much of recent history, the distinctive eye shapes of East and Central Asian populations have been turned into caricatures, into symbols used for both pride and prejudice. They have been exoticized, flattened into stereotypes, treated as signs of deep difference rather than as variations on a shared human template. Part of the quiet work of understanding their evolutionary history is to reframe them, to see them not as marks of otherness, but as one of many possible outcomes of our species' incredible capacity to adapt and diversify. Your eyes, whatever their shape, are part of that same capacity. So as you let the day slip farther away, as your thoughts begin to ebb and flow with the rhythm of your breath, you might hold this question gently in your mind. If my eyes are the eyes of people I know, carry this fold, this particular shape, what currents of deep time shaped it? What landscapes, what climates, what patterns of kinship and desire and chance left their faint signatures around my gaze? And if my eyes do not carry that fold, what different currents, what other paths through ice ages and migrations, unquiet genetic drift, lead to the lids I feel now when I close them? Tonight, we are not yet answering these questions. We are letting them open. We are acknowledging that the diversity of human eye shapes, especially the presence and variation of the epicanthic fold, is not a trivial curiosity, but a doorway into understanding how flexible and inventive our species has been in its journey. We are reminding ourselves that there is no single, all-encompassing explanation for why these features are so common in some regions, like East and Central Asia, and rarer in others, that the drivers behind them are multiple and interwoven. And we are taking seriously the idea that the adaptive significance of these traits, whether rooted in climate, in high-altitude light, in cold and wind, in social preference, or in the blind play of numbers, is a question worth lingering on, worth turning over slowly and carefully. The way you might turn a small, ancient artifact in your hands, feeling its weight, wondering about the people who made it and why. In the quiet of the night, with your own eyes resting, this question can feel less like a problem and more like a companion. There is something deeply human about it. This urge to look at a feature of our bodies and ask, how did this come to be? What story did my ancestors live over thousands of years to carve this shape into my face? That urge is itself part of our lineage, part of how our minds evolved to seek patterns, to ask why, to connect the present to the long shadow of the past. So let the question settle with you now. Feel your eyelids, their weight, their texture, the way they cover and protect the eyes beneath. Notice, just for a few heartbeats, their shape, their folds, their creases, whether they match what you see most often around you, or whether they sometimes make you feel set apart. Then let that awareness soften, because, for tonight, you do not need to have an answer. You do not need to solve the puzzle of why human eye shapes are as varied as they are, or why the epicanthic fold has danced in and out of different populations around the globe. You only need to know that there is a story there, a real and intricate story, one that we will trace through genes and climates and migrations, through chance and choice and deep time. A story that runs unbroken, from ancient faces turned up to glacial skies all the way to you, lying here on the edge of sleep. Those ancient faces, turned toward hard bright skies, are not just metaphors, they are part of the living chain of features that reached forward, generation by generation, to the face you know from the near. To begin to trace that chain, it helps to remember something simple and a little bit surprising beneath all these external differences. The eyeball itself, the small wet globe that actually gathers light, is almost the same size in people all over the world. About 20 minus from millimeters front to back, a little round world sheltered in a cave of bone, remarkably uniform across our species. So when you notice differences in eyes from place to place, you are not really seeing different eyeballs. You are seeing differences in the tissues that surround them, the lids, the small pads of fat, the subtle contours of bone, the way skin folds and hangs, the way tiny muscles pull, the epic and thick fold. That gentle curtain of skin along the inner corner is part of that outer architecture. And here is a quiet, humbling detail. Every human being, everywhere on earth, begins life with something like it in the soft, rounded faces of infants. That fold is there by default, like a starting sketch, a first draft. As children grow, in many lineages the fold recedes. The lids change shape, the crease above the eye deepens in other lineages. The fold remains, more or less pronounced, filling out the final drawing. That means the difference between having a prominent epic and thick fold in adulthood and having almost none is not about inventing something new, but about keeping or losing a feature that was already there in the beginning. It is a matter of timing, of growth, of how certain genetic instructions are turned up or down as the face matures. You can think of it a little like those sliders in a character minus creation screen, the ones that adjust brow depth for jaw shape or eye size by tiny increments. In our bodies, those sliders are not dragged by a hand, but by switches in our DNA, by inherited patterns that say keep growing this a bit longer or stop this process sooner. In some regions, many of those switches have come together in a particular configuration, a quiet chorus of instructions that makes the epic and thick fold more likely to stay, that shapes the eyelids and the tissues around them in a characteristic way. East and Central Asia are especially rich in that configuration, and part of that richness traces back to a specific genetic variant with a name that sounds almost like a code, IDA of 370A. You do not need to remember the name, but you might like the story that comes with it. Somewhere around 30 to 30-5,000 years ago, in a person living somewhere in Asia, a small change occurred in this gene. That person would not have known. Of course, they would have simply lived their life, hunted or gathered, loved and feared, raised children or helped raise the children of their kin. But that tiny alteration started to spread. We know it spread because today, that version of the gene is very common in East Asian populations, and is found, too, among many indigenous peoples of the Americas, whose ancestors carried it as they moved eastward across Asia and eventually into new continents. We also know that this variant influences more than one thing at a time. It is tied to thicker strands of hair, to a particular shape of the front teeth sometimes called shovel-shaped, to an increased number of sweat glands in the skin, and to the tendency for that epic and thick fold and related I-region features to be more pronounced. One change, many effects. That is what biologists call pleiotropy. But you can think of it simply as a single adjustment on a control panel that moves several sliders at once. And here is the thing: when scientists look at the patterns of this EDA, a 370A variant, at how common it is and how quickly it must have spread to reach such frequencies, They see the signature of strong selection, of an advantage that helped those who carried it leave more descendants. But the exact reason for that advantage, the exact balance between its effects, is still uncertain. It could be that, in at least some environments, having more sweat glands helped with temperature control. It could be that, in others, the combination of hair, teeth, and eyelid structure conferred small benefits that added up over many generations. It could be that social preferences began to favor the faces, the bodies, the textures associated with this variant, that people began to choose partners who looked a certain way, weaving culture and biology together. Most likely, as with so much in evolution, it was not one thing but a braid of many. Now, let your mind drift for a moment to the timing that spread. 30,000 years ago. 30 minus 5,000 years ago. These numbers place the rise of EDA, a 370A just before, and then during, a particularly harsh chapter in the story of climate, the last glacial Mexinan, around 20 minus 6,000 years ago, when ice sheets and bitter cold reshaped much of the northern hemisphere. In northeast Asia and across Siberia, winters would have been long and punishing. The air dry and razor minus sharp, the snowfields dazzling in their brightness. People living there would have faced not only freezing temperatures but relentless wind, swirling ice crystals, in the glare of low sun, an endless white. High mine, as altitude regions, too, came with their own assaults thin air. Intense ultraviolet light, desiccating winds that pulled moisture from skin and eyes alike. In such conditions, any smalt weak to the tissues around the eye that offered even a modest buff, a ray bit more insulation from wind, a slightly narrower opening against glare, a marginally more stable film of tears could tilt the scales, not by making anyone invincible, but by nudging the probabilities, by making it a little more likely that a person could keep watch, track movement, endure the elements, survive long enough to raise children. Layer that onto a genetic variant that also changes hair and glands and teeth, and you begin to see how a package of traits might have ridden the wave of those brutal millennia, aided by climate perhaps, and by chance, and by human preference. But remember, again, that environment alone does not command our features like a sculptor with total control. If cold and glare were the only forces that mattered, every icy region would show exactly the same ice structures, the same folds and lids, and warm places would have none of them. The world does not look like that. Instead, we see the epicanthic fold and related traits cropping up in multiple, scattered populations in East and Central Asia, yes, but also among some Arctic peoples, among groups in Central Asia, in some African communities, such as the Quosan, among the Sami of northern Scandinavia, and among many indigenous peoples of the Americas. These populations are not all closely related in the recent sense, and yet echoes of similar I-region anatomy appear. That is convergent evolution in action, the same general shapes arriving by different genetic paths, in different branches of our family tree, under partly similar but not identical pressures. Sometimes, a small founding group, carrying particular versions of genes just by chance, moves into a new land, and their descendants, shaped by isolation and intermarriage, see those versions become common, not because they are necessarily better, but because they happen to be there when the circle was drawn. That is founder effect. That is genetic drift, the blind arithmetic of reproduction and separation. Other times, people in those groups begin to see certain rates as familiar, as comforting, as beautiful. They choose partners who resemble their kin, who carry the same folds and curves and colors. And over time, these preferences reinforce what started as chance, or a subtle adaptation. Across Asia, as small bands left Africa, split, moved, reunited, and split again, this dance of drift and selection and culture kept playing out over and over. Some lineages experienced bottlenecks, moments when only a few individuals carried the future forward, and whatever features they happened to have, eye shapes, nose shapes, hair textures, became the seed for entire regional populations. Other lineages stayed connected to many neighbors, smoothing out extremes through constant gene flow. When you look into the diversity of eyes on our planet, you are seeing the layered result of all of this: ice ages and plateaus, storms and sun, tiny genes which is like EDA, a 370 ace, weeping through some populations and not others, small groups wandering unsettling, lovers choosing each other, babies inherited into particular combinations of traits, and intertwined with all of these threads are the mysteries that remain. How much of the spread of that Kiev variant was due to climate, and how much to social preference? How strong were the protective advantages of those eyelid configurations in the coldest winds, and how much of their persistence now is simply inertia, a legacy carried forward because nothing pushed hard enough to remove it? Why did similar folds arise in distant populations under different skies? No one line of evidence answers those questions fully yet, and perhaps that is fitting. The story of your face, of anyone's face, is not an neat equation, but a long, wandering narrative. Some chapters missing, some pages blurred. As you lie here, your own eyelids growing heavier, you carry that narrative without having to think about it. The thickness of your hair, the shape of your front teeth, the way your upper lid falls over your eye. These are each a quiet letter in a message written by thousands of ancestors who survived cold snaps and droughts, who crossed rivers and plains, who stayed put or set out, who made choices about partners and families, who passed on, again and again, the particular variants they happened to bear. You do not have to decode that message tonight. You do not have to solve which fraction of your features came from glacial winds and which from the unspoken preferences of people long gone. It is enough to know that, behind the simple act of closing your eyes, there lies a tapestry woven through deep time, its threads passing through Ice Age Siberian high plateaus, through small, isolated camps and bustling migration routes, through genetic variants like EDA or 370 ace, weeping through some lineages and bypassing others. It is enough to feel in the gentle weight of your lids the presence of all those hidden histories, layered and intertwined, bringing you to this moment at the edge of sleep. So now, as you lie there with your eyes growing slow and heavy, let's walk a little closer to the evidence, to the quiet, physical clues written into your face, the ones that tell us where these shapes came from and what they have endured. Have you ever noticed, by the way, that people talk about big eyes and small eyes, as if some of us were walking around with goldfish bowls in our skulls and others with tiny marbles, and yet, when you step back into the calm light of biology, something very simple appears. Here's the thing. The human eyeball itself, the round, delicate globe inside your skull, is almost the same size in everyone on Earth, about 24 millimeters from front to back. No matter what continent your ancestors walked, no matter what shape the opening of your eyelids might seem to carve around it, your eyes are not smaller or larger because of where your lineage traveled, not in the globe itself. What you and I notice when we say someone has big eyes or narrow eyes is mostly not the ball at all. It is the wrapping, the curtains, the soft flesh and the bony frame around that same small, shining sphere. If you picture a row of identical light bulbs, every one of them, the same wattage and the same glass shell, and then imagine putting a different lampshade over each one widened open, one tightened narrow, one covered in a thick fabric that softens the glow, one set deep inside a metal, would you begin to see what is happening in faces? The bulb is your eyeball, the lampshade is your eyelids, the fat beneath the skin, the bones that make your brow and cheek, the differences that your brain reads in a fraction of a second. This person looks sleepy, that person looks alert, this person seems to have wide eyes, that person's eyes look small. are coming from the way those surrounding structures have been sculpted by bone and flesh and heritage. The ball itself, behind all that, just sits there, quietly doing its job, almost the same size in all of us. So when we talk about epic and thick folds, that soft, graceful fold of upper eyelid skin that lies over the inner corner of the eye, we are talking about a small variation in those curtains, not in the light behind them. A tiny rearrangement of how the skin drapes, how the underlying tissues are layered, how the lid hangs. And that tiny rearrangement, it turns out, carries stories that are bigger than continents. You've probably heard, or perhaps simply absorbed without hearing it said aloud, that epic and thick folds are somehow East Asian eyes. That phrase floats around in media and everyday speech, attaching a world of history to a few millimeters of skin. But if you travel in your mind across the map, if you let yourself drift, north then east, then far south, then into the Arctic twilight, you'll find those same folds watching the same cold sky in many places. They are not the property of any one region. They appear in people who live in the Arctic, whose ancestors watched the sun skate low over a horizon lined with ice, who walked across frozen season snow fields that blazed white under the pale light. They appear in Central Asia, in lineages that crossed vast steppe landscapes, windswept and open, under her bright skies. They appear in some African peoples like the Quosan, whose ancestors carried deep and ancient lineages in the south of that first continent, their features shaped by stories even older than the Ice Age tales of the north. They appear in the Semi of Scandinavia, reined ear-herders and forest dwellers, whose lives brushed against unknown, unlocating light in the far European north. They appear among indigenous peoples of the Americas, descendants of those who once crossed high latitudes and harsh lands from Asia into a new world, carrying with them whatever traits the small ancestral groups happened to bear. Arctic, Central Asian, some African groups like the Quosan, Scandinavian semi-indigenous Americans, East Asians, the same fold, the same soft arc of skin, appears again and again, like a recurring motif in a long song, sometimes subtle, sometimes pronounced, sometimes only a whisper at the inner corner of the eye. But they're echoing. When you think of it that way, the idea that the stripe belongs to only one region falls away, doesn't it? The map becomes more complicated, more interesting. That single detail of eyelid anatomy becomes less like a national flag and more like a shared refrain, rising independently in different lineages, converging because of shared pressures and shared environments and shared histories of chance. And as you sink a little deeper into the mattress, as your body grows heavier and your breathing stretches out, there is another layer of this story that sits much closer to your own life, one you might even be able to see if you think back. All human babies come into the world with epic and thick folds. Every child, no matter where they are born, starts life with that soft curtain of skin that makes their eyes look rounder, less angular, slightly more hooded at the inner corner. If you look at old photographs of yourself as a newborn, or if you have ever studied the faces of babies around you, you may have seen this without knowing it had a name, or that it meant anything at all. But it is there, a universal starting point. In many people, those folds recede as childhood passes, as the bones of the face grow, as the eyelids lengthen and stretch, as the soft tissues rearrange themselves with age. The inner corner opens up. The fold smooths out or disappears. The eyes take on the shape that will carry them through adolescence and adulthood. That early, universal fold is like a sketch that gets redrawn as you grow. But in others, the fold persists, holds its shape, stays present into adulthood, sometimes subtly, sometimes prominently. And this persistence, this choice made by the body to keep the fold instead of letting it fade, is under the quiet guidance of genes, of small hereditary instructions that tell the tissues where to grow, how much to grow, when to stop. So in a way, You can imagine that all of humanity begins from a shared template, a baby face carrying epic and thick folds. And then, as we each grow, our individual genetic codes decide how far to move away from that starting point. For some lineages, the instruction is, keep this shape, let it be part of the adult face. For others, the message is, let this soften and retreat, open up the inner corner. The persistence or fading of that fold becomes one more slider in a complex, invisible control panel. One more choice made long before you were born, by combinations of variants passed down through countless generations. As you breathe in and out and feel your own eyelids resting on your eyes, you are carrying the result of those tiny instructions. You may carry a pronounced fold, a faint one, or almost none at all, but you began with one, and what remains is determined by the inheritance written inside you. So now we have 3 threads in our hands, 3 small but powerful pieces of evidence. First, the eyeball itself, nearly the same in everyone, like a constant background instrument. Second, the epic and thick fold, not a regional label but a trait that shows up across the globe. In Arctic hunters and Central Asian herders, in crows and foragers and Sami reindeer keepers, in East Asians and indigenous Americans. Third, the early presence of the fold in every infant, and its genetic regulation, its tendency to stay or to recede, depending on inherited instructions. Where do those instructions come from? What shaped them? Why would some lineages find themselves, tens of thousands of years later, with a higher chance of keeping that fold deep into adulthood, while others rarely do? To answer that, you have to step back, way back. You have to walk out of the bedroom of tonight and into a different room in time, into a long, frozen corridor that Earth passed through around 26,000 years ago. Imagine yourself standing, not on worn carpet or wooden floor, but on hard, the kind that has been smashed by wind and weight until it quakes under your feet. The air is viciously cold, a kind of cold that bites exposed skin in seconds, that makes the tiny hairs in your nose freeze, that steals your breath when you try to inhale too deeply. You are in what scientists call the last glacial maximum, but you don't need the term, you just need the feeling. It is the peak of the last great ice age, when ice sheets spread wide over northern lands, when glaciers crept down mountains, when vast regions that are now fields or forests were swept by wind and hung with frost. In Northeast Asian Siberia, where some of your distant cousins once walked, the environment was extreme. The cold was harsh and constant. The winds were wrung, slicing across open plains, picking up particles of ice in the snow and driving them like tiny blades into whatever skin they could find. Above, the sky might be clear, the air thin and bright, and the ground beneath your feet blinding, an endless white that reflected the sun's light straight back into your eyes. Extreme cold, windy, high glare. Those 3 words, simple as they are, describe what it was like to open your eyes there. To look up, you would have to squint, eyelashes frosting over, tears threatening to freeze at the corners. To look out across the land, you would contend with the kind of brightness that makes you shut your eyes almost involuntarily, forcing you to peek through the narrowest possible slit between your lids. To walk into the wind, you might turn your face slightly, use your brow or your cheeks as shields, anything to protect the fragile surfaces of your eyes from the onslaught of cold and light. Now, stop for a moment and imagine that this isn't a camping trip or a day on a ski slope or something you can escape by stepping back inside. Imagine instead that this is every day, every winter, year after year, generation after generation. The baseline reality in which people have to search for food, raise children, travel, trade, fall in love, argue, make up, sit by fires, bury their dead. In such a world, any small anatomical tweak that helps your eyes cope with that brutality might make life a little easier, not in some grand, dramatic way. Just enough to make snow blindness slightly less frequent, to make icy winds slightly less damaging to the delicate tissues, to reduce the amount of glare that enters the eye when the sun hangs low and white off the snow. You and I cannot watch this directly. We have no time machine, no way to see how tiny changes in eyelid shape might have played out there in those glacial landscapes. But we can look at the conditions. We can look at who lived there and who still lies in such places now. And we can note that, among the traits more common in these populations, we find epic and thick folds, deeper periorbital fat, shapes that create narrower openings around the eyes. The last glacial maximum, about 26,000 years ago, set the stage. It carved out an enormous cold theater across Northeast Asia and Siberia. People survived there, huddled against the wind, their bodies and faces exposed to that trio forces: extreme cold, relentless wind, intense glare from snow. For your eyes, for the delicate tissues that keep those 24mm globes moist and functional, this was a harsh test. Any subtle arrangement of eyelids and surrounding fat that offered just a touch more protection, just a slight narrowing of exposure, could be useful. If you shift your imaginary position now and climb in your mind up into the mountains, the story continues in another form. Think of a high plateau like the Tibetan Plateau, though we do not need to cling to its modern name to feel what it's like. You are far from sea level, your body working harder for each breath because the air is thin. The landscape stretches around you, vast and exposed, the horizon running away in every direction. Seasons are sharp. The air is often dry, the winds insistent, the sun fierce. At high altitudes like these, the challenges to your eyes are a little different, but just as relentless. The ultraviolet radiation from the sun is stronger, unfiltered by as much atmosphere. Snow, when it covers the ground, reflects that harsh light back at you, producing snow glare that can ache in your head and burn your eyes if you stare out unprotected. The air pulls moisture from your skin and from the surface of your eyes, leaving them dry and irritated. The wind, again, carries dust, ice, and cold. Intense UV, snow glare, dry air. Wind, the same small orb above an eye, around 24mm in length, has to cope with all of that. It has no way to grow a thicker cornea on its own. Instead, the body must rely on the structures around the eyelids. The tear film, the patterns with which the skin folds and the fat cushions. In such environments, narrower openings, folds that reduce direct exposure, thicker surrounding tissues that help maintain warmth and moisture, might be helpful in quiet, everyday ways that accumulate across years and generations. You can picture, if you let yourself, a child growing up on such a plateau, eyes half squinted against the bright, high sun reflected from snow, cheeks and brow, bone reddened by wind, face turned slightly downward as they walk into the gust. They have no idea that they are part of some slow process of adaptation. They are just trying to see to tend livestock, to help their family, to play. But their bodies are carrying, in each cell, the choices made by ancestors who survived in this kind of place, under this kind of sky. When you put these environments side by side in your mind, the glacial plains of Northeast Asia, Siberia during the last glacial maximum, the high harsh plateaus where UV, snow glare, dryness, and wind all bear down, you begin to see a pattern in the pressures that human eyes have had to endure. And now we can turn to the level of molecules and instructions, to that quiet script inside each of your cells that tells your eyelids how to form in the first place. Genetic studies, when they trace the differences between lineages and look for patterns in who carries what traits, have found one particular variant that stands out in many East Asian populations. It is known, in the language of genetics, as EDA of 370A. a change in a gene that has effects in several parts of the body. This variant, IDA or 370A, seems to have arisen roughly 30 to 35,000 years ago, somewhere in the lineages that would later spread through East Asia. That is, to put it in a different perspective, more than 1,000 generations ago. Many thousands of parent-to-child handoffs in the past, well before the last glacial maximum reached its peak, but within the same broad stretch of deep time when ice sheets were growing and climates were shifting. What makes EDA or 370A so fascinating, as you lie here with your own body quietly humming along, is not just that it exists, but that it touches many traits at once. Genetic studies have associated the single variant with thicker hair, with front teeth that are shovel-shaped in cross-section, with an increased density of sweat glands, and with the presence of epicanthic folds in East Asian populations. One small change in a single genetic sequence, and many different parts of the body listen. Thicker hair means a different texture and thickness of the strands that cover your scalp, perhaps a slightly altered way in which they shield your head from sun or cold. Shovel-shaped incisors mean that if you looked at the cross-section of the front teeth, you would see a certain contour, like a small hollow or ridge, a subtlety you don't notice in everyday life, but that anthropologists can track like a signature. Increased sweat glands mean a different pattern of cooling, a different way of dealing with heat or moisture on the skin, and epicanthic folds, and a different drape of skin over the eye. EDA or 370A is a reminder that evolution often works through such multi-purpose switches, that a single change can ripple through the body in several tissues. When such a variant arises and then spreads through a population, it may do so not because of one single advantage, but because the blend of its effects in a particular environment and under particular conditions happens to fit well. If you carry ancestry from East Asia, there is a chance that this ancient variant is part of your own code, whispering its instructions to your hair follicles, your sweat glands, your eyelids. You do not need to know whether you have it. Your body has already listened to it, or not, and grown accordingly. As you sink deeper into the cushions of your bed, you can imagine EDA of 370A as one among many such switches. One tiny sentence in the long genetic story that your ancestors passed down. Its presence in many East Asian populations and its association with epicanthic folds is part of the reason that the fold is more common there. Not the only reason, but an important piece. Now, step back again, not just to look at one region, one gene, one environment, but to consider the way humans spread across the earth, carrying these variants with them like seeds in their pockets. Our species walked out of Africa and across Asia in waves, not once, but many times, in pulses and drifts, sometimes rapidly, sometimes slowly, sometimes in great numbers, sometimes in small groups. And population genetics, the study of how genes move and change in groups over time, offers us a way to understand how these traits either became common or faded into rarity as those movements unfolded. When small groups break off from a larger, original population and move into new territories, something called a founder effect can occur. Imagine a community of hundreds of thousands in which only a few people happen to have a particular trait, say, a certain shape of eyelid or a certain variant in a gene like EDAR. If a tiny group of 20 or 50 people leaves this larger community to settle somewhere new, and by chance, several of them carry that trait, then that little caravan becomes a kind of genetic bottleneck. Whatever they happen to bring with them in those few bodies will be overrepresented in the new community they form. It is as if you selected a handful of colored threads from a vast tapestry at random. The colors in your handful may not match the overall distribution in the original fabric. If you then used only those threads to weave a new cloth, That new cloth would have a different pattern, one that reflects chance as much as design. A bottleneck is what we call it when a population passes through such a narrow opening in numbers. For a time, there are few individuals, and in that narrow moment, rare traits can become common purely because of who happened to survive, who happened to leave, who happened to have children. Founder effects are the echoes of those narrow passages, the way those chance selections leave their mark on descending groups. Across Asia, as human groups moved out of Africa and spread through different landscapes, they did so under the influence of both selection and chance, both adaptation and random drift. They carried with them the traits that were already present in their home populations, but not all in the same frequencies. Some lineages carried higher frequencies of variance, like EDA or 370A. Some did not carry it at all. Some lineages walked into the brutal cold and wind of Northeast Asia and Siberia. Others stayed nearer to the equator or took different routes. Over long stretches of time, this meant that some small groups, exposed to harsh glacial winds or high-altitude UV and snow glare, happened also to be enriched by chance and by past history for traits like epicanthic folds. Then, as they stayed, as they grew, as they had children and great-grandchildren in that same environment, any advantages those traits brought could be gently amplified by natural selection, adding to the initial boost given by the bottleneck. At the same time as people moved and met, they did not remain sealed or forever. Gene flow, the quiet, steady movement of genetic variants from one population to another through intermarriage, through the simple act of having children together, wove these traits across broader regions. The line between this group and that group blurred, as it always has. Variance flowed along trade routes and migration routes, back and forth, traced not by borders or maps, but by relationships, by unions, by shared lives. So when you look, today, at the presence of epicanthic folds across the Arctic, in Central Asia, among some African groups like the Khoisan, among the Sami, among indigenous Americans, and in East Asia, you are seeing the results of all of these forces layered together. You are seeing the imprint of ancient environments: glacial cold, wind, glare, leb, high-altitude UV, dry air pressing gently but persistently on the bodies of people who lived there for many generations. You are seeing the fingerprints of genetic variants, like EDA or 370A, which arose tens of thousands of years ago and, through its effects on hair, teeth, sweat glands, and eyelids, threaded itself through many East Asian lineages. You are seeing the marks of founder effects and bottlenecks, when small groups carried certain rates out of larger ancestral populations and into new lands, making those traits more common in their descendants than they had been in their ancestors. You are seeing the traces of gene flow, the mixing and mingling of lineages as people met, traveled together, intermarried, and raised children whose faces blended traits from different branches of the human family. And underneath all of that, you are seeing the shared human starting point, the fact that all babies, everywhere, begin with epicanthic folds, and that whether those folds persist into adulthood or recede is determined by inherited instructions, by the turning up or down of certain genetic dials. As your breath grows slower, you might imagine these processes not as sharp or abrupt things, but as soft, overlapping waves. A wave of cold presses across Siberia and Northeast Asia during the last glacial maximum, making narrow eye openings more helpful for reducing glare and protecting against freezing wind. A wave of people walks out of Africa, then fans across Asia, branching and branching, small bands occasionally isolating themselves, passing through bottlenecks where certain rates become common simply because those who survive or leave happen to carry them. A wave of genetic variant spreads through some of those bands, EDA, a 370A, among them touching multiple traits at once. including the shape of eyelids and the presence of epic and thick folds. A wave of high-altitude settlement settles onto plateaus, where UV and wind and snow glare test the resilience of eyes once again. A wave of gene flow carries traits like epic and thick folds into new combinations, into indigenous American lineages that trace back to ancestors who crossed the north, into the faces of Sami herders in the European north, into some African groups like the Quosan whose history is deep and complex on their own continent. These waves do not move alone. They overlap, interfere, reinforce, cancel, like ripples in a pond. And the resulting pattern is what you see when you look around you at faces, at eyelids, at the astonishing diversity of human eye shapes. When you turn your gaze inward, in your memory, to your own family, you might even recall how these patterns play out on a very small scale. A grandparent with a certain eye shape, a parent with another, siblings whose eyes look more like one side of the family or the other. The same underlying process is inheritance. Recombination, the persistence or fading of traits, are acting there too, just in a much shorter, more familiar time frame. The evidence we have, in other words, is layered. On the anatomical level, we know that your eyeball is about 24 millimeters in size, like almost everyone else's, and that most of what we perceive as different eye shapes comes from the eyelids, the fat deposits, and the bone structure around that constant globe. On the observational level, we can map epic and thick folds across the world and note their presence in East Asia. Yes, but also in the Arctic, in Central Asia, in some African groups, such as the Quosan, in the Sami, and among indigenous Americans, which tells us that this trait did not evolve once in one place and stay there, but instead has appeared and persisted in different lineages. On the developmental level, we see that all human infants are born with epic and thick folds, and that their continuation or disappearance in adulthood is regulated by genetic instructions, by the timing and pattern of facial growth. On the environmental level, we understand that the last glacial maximum brought extreme cold, strong winds, and high levels of glare across the snowy expanses of Northeast Asian Siberia, and that high-altitude environments like the Tibetan Plateau subject ties to intense UV, snow glare, dry air, and wind conditions in which certain eyelid structures may be beneficial. On the genetic level, we recognize that a variant like IDA, or 370A, which arose 30 to 35,000 years ago, is strongly associated in East Asian populations with several traits at once thicker hair, shovel-shaped incisors, increased sweat glands, and epic and thick folds, showing how one small change in the genome can affect multiple anatomical features. On the population level, we see the marks of founder effects, bottlenecks, and gene flow during human migrations out of Africa and across Asia, processes that can make traits more or less common in certain lineages, independently of whether they were strongly selected by the environment or simply carried along by chance and mixture. Taken together, these layers of evidence do not shout at you. They do not demand belief. They whisper. They whisper that the shapes around your eyes are not random, but neither are they the product of a single simple cause. They are the result of a long dance between environment and inheritance, between ice and sunlight and thin air, between small migrating bands and the variants they happened to carry. And as you let your own eyelids rest a little more heavily, maybe even closing them now and again as you listen, you might notice how differently this makes you feel about your own face. Instead of being just something you see in a mirror, something you may have judged or compared or worried about at different times in your life, it becomes a fossil record of sorts, a living archive. The thickness of your eyelids, the presence or absence of a fold at the inner corner of your eyes, the way the skin lies over the globe beneath fixed theirs and miles. All of it is evidence, quietly testifying to glacial plains and high plateaus, to ancestors who weathered wind and glare, to the drift of small founding groups, to the reach of genes like EDA or 370A, to the shared starting point of all babies everywhere. Even if you never know the precise path your own lineage took, you can feel those possibilities in the weight of your eyelids tonight. You can imagine your 24mm eye, cushioned in its socket, held safe behind its curtains of skin and fat and bone, doing the same simple job it has always done for your ancestors, letting in light, translating it into images, guiding your steps and your hands and your choices. And now, as you lie, you're in a room that is likely far from those glacial winds or high-altitude suns. Your eyes have one more job, perhaps the gentlest one of all: to close, to rest, to let the ancient story carried in their shape recede into the background, like a campfire glowing low as the last people around it drift to sleep, knowing, without needing to put it into words, that they are part of a lineage that has watched many skies, endured many climates, crossed many thresholds, and survived all of them long enough to give you this quiet night. And as you think of that lineage, of all those faces turned toward wind and snow and thin, brilliant skies, another question may drift through your mind, quiet but insistent. Why do some people, in such distant places, carry such similar structures around their eyes? People in the Arctic, wrapped in frozen moving across frozen seas. People on high plateaus, herding animals under cold, searing sunlight. People in African landscapes, like the Quozen, whose history on that continent stretches back in ways that are deep and intricate. People in the far north of Europe like the Sami, following reindeer under low, icy suns. People in the Americas, descended from those who crossed through the northern cold. Different continents, different languages, different stories. And yet, sometimes, a familiar fold at the inner corner of the eye, a similar narrowing of the opening, a similar curtain of skin. Here's the thing, and it's one of the most beautiful ideas in all of biology sometimes. When the world asks the same kind of question in many places, life gives similar answers. Cold asks a question. Snow glare asks a question. Wind and dryness and high-altitude light all ask their questions, and human bodies, your ancestors' bodies, answer with whatever variations they happen to have, whatever sliders are already present in the genetic menu, whatever small shifts in eyelid thickness or fat distribution or growth timing can offer a little more protection, a little more comfort, a little more safety for the precious, delicate surface of the eye. This is convergent evolution, though you don't need the term to feel it. It is simply many lineages, in many places, arriving at somewhat similar solutions because they faced somewhat similar pressures, each one using the materials it already had, each one weaving its own version of the pattern. But the story is not just about the ice, or the glare, or the wind. It is also about chance, about small groups carrying certain rakes, just because that is who happened to be there when a valley opened or a route northward thawed. It is about founder effects and bottlenecks, those moments when only a few people move on, and whatever eye shapes they carry become, for their descendants, the starting point. And it is about attraction, and culture, and the quiet, powerful force of what people find beautiful in one another. If, in a certain community, a particular eye shape is seen as striking, or warm, or reminiscent of beloved ancestors, then people with that shape may find partners more easily, raising children who carry those same traits, and over generations, the preference and the feature reinforce each other. That is sexual selection, not in some dramatic, peacock feather way, but in the soft, everyday reality of who people turn toward, whose eyes they find themselves lingering on a cross, a fire, or a village square. So you have cold and wind and glare applying their pressure from the outside, and you have genes drifting and concentrating as small bands move and split, and you have desire and affection shaping who pairs with whom from the inside. You have cultural stories about beauty and identity and belonging, all layered over the biology, all of them leaving faint fingerprints on the shapes of faces. No single one of these forces is the real cause. They work together, as a chorus, even at the level of a single variant, like EDA or 370A. The story resists simplification. That tiny change in the genetic code touches thicker hair, shovel-shaped incisors, increased sweat glands, endepic and thick folds all at once. A bundle of traits moving together through certain East Asian lineages. We see signs that this variant spread strongly, as if something about that whole bundle was favored, as if the environment or the way people lived and chose partners gave it a quiet but persistent advantage. Yet the precise reason was it the hair, the teeth, the sweat, the eyelids, or the combination remains one of those mysteries that science has not fully unraveled. And here is the truth that can be strangely comforting as you lie there in the dark. It is all right that we do not know every detail. The shapes of human eyes, the presence or absence of an epic and thick fold, the thickness of skin and the angle of bones, are the product of so many threads woven together: climate and chance, desire and migration, single genes with multiple effects, that no diagram on a page could ever capture the full richness. What we can say, with quiet confidence, is that no particular eye shape is a mark of superiority or inferiority. None is more normal or more correct in any cosmic sense. Each is a record of how a lineage met its world. Each is a different solution to the same basic set of problems. Keep the eye safe. Keep the light useful. Keep the body going long enough to grow, to love, to raise another generation. So, at any point in your life, you have looked at your own eyes and measured them against someone else's, wishing for a different angle, a different fold, a different curve. You can let that comparisons often now you carry, in the way your eyelids rest and move, the accumulated answers of thousands of generations, the compromises struck between harsh environments and fragile tissue, between random drift and strong selection, between the quiet diffusion of a gene like EDA or 370I and the still uncertain reasons it was favored. Your eyes are part of a tapestry so wide you cannot see its edges. You close them now, and in that closing you echo a gesture repeated in Ice Age shelters, in high-altitude tents, in desert camps and forest clearings. People who had different languages, different myths, different tools, but the same need to let their vision go dim for a while, to sink back from the brightness of the day. They lay down. Those ancestors of yours and mine, and their last waking sight was often the reflection of fire in another person's eyes, or the pale band of the sky at dawn, or the shadows of a cave ceiling above them. You perhaps see the faint outline of a ceiling, or the soft glow of a screen, or nothing at all as the room dims. Their eyelids lowered, yours lowered, their breathing slowed. Yours slows now in undoubt, like waves on some ancestral shore. And as the details of genes and ice ages and convergent folds drift further away, like footprints filling slowly with snow, all that remains is the simple, enduring fact that you are here, at the far end of an almost unthinkable story, with eyes that have done their work for the day. You can let them rest, trusting that the legacy they carry will still be there in the morning, written in the gentle curve of skin and the quiet resilience beneath it, waiting for whatever light tomorrow brings. And yet, before you let go completely, before the last little thread of wakefulness slips from your fingers, there is something quiet and important we can do together, right here in this soft, half-minus dreaming place. We can zoom out, gently, and look at the whole tapestry at once, because all night, in a way, we have been following a single strand, the story of why some eyes, like yours perhaps, carry a fold of skin that softens the upper lid, that makes the opening seem narrower, more sheltered, more secret. And we have talked about ice and wind and thin air, about mutations and migrations, and ancestors huddled under strange skies. But the truth is, this was never just a story about one fold of skin. It has been a story about how complexity itself takes shape on a human face. Have you ever noticed how tempting it is, when you look at something puzzling, to want a clean, simple answer? One cause, one reason, one line you can underline and say, "Yes, that's it, that's why." It's such a human impulse. It feels safe and tidy. It makes the world seem more manageable. And yet, the faces of our species, the curve of an eyelid, the angle of a cheekbone, the thickness of a lip, they don't arise from tidy, single causes. They are the result of many quiet forces weaving together, overlapping, enforcing, and sometimes contradicting each other across thousands of generations, until what you see in the mirror now is the product of that whole intricate conversation. Here's the thing. When you look at different eye shapes around the world, you're not seeing one story played out in different costumes. You're seeing many different stories that have converged on similar solutions, like strangers from different cities who, without ever meeting, all invent something that looks almost the same, because they are all, in their own ways, responding to the same kind of problem. This is what biologists call convergent evolution, but you don't need the term. Really? Just imagine people in very distant places, people who will never know of each other's existence, waking to the same kind of cold that slices at the skin, trudging through light so bright off snow or ice that it hurts to keep your eyes open wide, squinting into wind that dries and stings and fills the lushes with frost. Imagine them on high plateaus where the air is thin and sharp, where the sun feels closer, more unforgiving, where its light bounces off pale ground and rock, and pours into the eyes from every angle. And then imagine that, over many, many lifetimes, the people who happen to have eyes that sit a little more sheltered, lids that narrow the opening a little, folds that drape a little more over the inner corner, fare just a tiny bit better in those places, day after day, year after year, ice age after ice age. Not dramatically better, not in a way you could see in a single lifetime, just slightly more comfortable, slightly more protected, slightly less damaged by glare and grit and cold and dryness. A small edge. In a harsh world, a small edge can matter. So similar eye structures, similar folds, and narrowed openings and layers of protective fattened skin arise in people living in the Arctic, and in people on windswept Asian steppes, and in some of the oldest lineages of southern Africa, and in groups scattered along high, exposed landscapes, and even in some families far to the north in Europe. Not because they all trace back to one original group that had a special eye shape and spread it around the world intact, but because similar pressures can sculpt similar shapes out of the underlying human clay over and over, just as similar winds carve similar ripples in two dunes of sand that have never touched each other. That's the power of convergent evolution. Different branches of the human family tree, walking different migration paths, living under different myths and speaking different words to name the stars above them, gradually, quietly growing similar features because the snow, and the glare, and the wind, and the thin, dry air whispered the same message into their genes. Protect the eyes, shelter them, narrow the opening a little, wrap them in a softer frame. But even that, even this clear, elegant idea is only one part of the truth, and if we stop there it would still feel like one of those two minus simple answers, neat but incomplete, because your face, any face, is never carved by environment alone. The cold and the UV, the wind and the glare, they're only some of the sculptor's tools, and if you pull back just a little more, you can see that there are other hands shaping you too, subtler ones, quieter ones, hands made of chance and preference and culture. Think for a moment about genetic drift. It sounds technical, but the reality is almost homely, almost like something you can feel in your fingertips. Picture a bowl full of colored beads, thousands of them, Most of one color, some of another, a few of a third. That bowl is like the gene pool of an ancient population, full of different variants of traits, different versions of the genes that nudge eyelids and cheekbones and skin folds in slightly different directions. Now picture a small group leaving, a few dozen people breaking away and walking over the horizon, taking with them just a handful of beads scooped up at random from that big bowl. What colors land in their pockets? Not all of them, not in the same proportions. Just whatever happened to be taken by chance in that one tiny moment. In that scoop, some colors may be missing entirely, others may suddenly be common. Not because they were better, not because they were chosen, but simply because that's how the handful fell. And then, as that small group wanders and settles and has children and grandchildren, it is that new skewed mix of beads, that particular bundle of genetic variants, that gets passed on undone. Over time, some traits become common in that isolated lineage, just because they were in the right place at the right time, just because they were in the handful that left. This is genetic drift. It doesn't care about usefulness. It doesn't care about beauty. It doesn't care about survival in any direct way. It is the roll of the dice, the shuffle of the deck, the pattern of beads in a cupped hand. And this too, shapes, eye shapes, and faces, and bodies, sometimes a fold of skin, or a way that fat pads around the eyes, or the thickness of the eyelid itself, might spread through a small group, not because it offered any special protection against cold or glare, but simply because the people who carried it happened to be the ones who stayed, who had more children, who formed the core of that new band. So now you have at least two forces intertwined: the rough, insistent sculpting of environment, cold, wind, sunlight, snow, and the soft, blind drift of chance, beads falling in patterns no one chose. And there is still more, because humans, unlike almost any other animal, don't just survive in environments. We build worlds of meaning on top of those environments. We tell stories about faces. We decide what is beautiful. We decide what is familiar, what feels like home, what feels like home. And those stories, those feelings, those choices, they also quietly shape who has children with whom, whose features are passed down under-amplified, whose faces become the local standard without anyone ever voting on it or writing it down. Think of sexual selection and cultural preference, not as some fleshy, dramatic force, but as a gentle, persistent breeze that blows over every generation. Two people meet, they fall in love, or in something like love, and often, without knowing why, they are drawn to certain traits, to certain ways eyes sit in a face, to certain distances between eyebrows, to certain angles of jaw or cheek. Multiply that slowly, across 1,000 years, across 100,000 quiet choices, and you can see how features that once were rare could become common, how a particularized shape might become, in that place at that time, the familiar shape, the cherished shape, the shape that feels right when someone smiles across a fire, or across a field, or across a marketplace. These choices don't erase the environment's influence. They dance with it. In a cold, bright world, a sheltered eye might be both useful and, eventually, considered beautiful. The eye that squints less in glare, that tears less in wind, might also be the eye that people learn unconsciously to like, because it is the eye they see most often on the faces they love. So natural selection, sexual selection, cultural preferences, genetic drift, they all blend. They don't cancel each other. They rarely act alone. They build on one another. No single theory, it was all about the cold, or it was all about high minus altitude sunlight, or it was all about what people found attractive, can ever stand alone as the reason, because the real reason, the deep minus time reason, is that all of them work together, to different degrees, in different places, over different spans of time. When you look for one explanation, The explanation, you always end up with something that feels a little brittle, a little too thin for the richness of the human story, because your face, and every face, is a compromise between many forces. The environment whispering, do this and you will survive a little better. Chance murmuring, you happen to be here at this moment, and so you carried these traits forward. Desire and affection, and beauty saying, these are the faces we choose, and so these are the faces that will echo into the future, layered on top of each other, and threaded through all of that, at the level so small, you can't see it, so tiny that your ancestors never even knew it existed. There are particular genetic variants that ride those forces, carried by them like leaves on currents. One of them has been especially important in our story tonight, a tiny change in a gene called DDAR, a single minus letter difference in the script of life that arose somewhere in East Asia, roughly 30 to 30-5,000 years ago, long before any written word, long before farms or cities or metal, when people still moved with herds and seasons and the turning of the ice. That one change, often called DDA a 370A, did something subtle but far minus reaching. It altered how certain tissues grow and form. It thickened hair strands, made them more robust, more tightly packed. It shaped the roots of teeth, giving many people what are called shovel minus shaped incisors. It affected how many sweat glands you have, how densely they dot your skin. It influenced how fat and skin and connective tissue arrange themselves in parts of the face, including around the eyes. One mutation, many ripples. Biologists call that pleiotropy, when one genetic change touches many different traits, like a single adjustment in a computer program that unexpectedly changes how several different parts of the interface behave. You don't have to remember the word, but you can feel the idea. A tiny tweak, high up in the blueprint, ends up altering many finished details. And when scientists look at the DNA of people today, whose ancestors came from that broad Eastern Central Asian region, from places swept by glacial winds and intense monsoon rains, from plateaus and river valleys and long coastlines, they see something striking around this EDAR variant. They see that the stretch of DNA that carries it has what they call the mark of a selective sweep, which is just a way of saying that, at some point, this particular version of the gene spread very quickly through a population, much faster than random chance would normally allow, as if the people who carried it had an advantage that nudged them, and their descendants, to become more numerous, leaving a strong, unmistakable signal in the genetic record, like a brushstroke code that is bolder than all the others. So they know this. They know that EDAR 370 did not just drift lazily through the generations, it rode a wave of positive selection. It was favored, pushed along by the forces of survival in a way most variants are not. But here is where the mystery deepens again, where simplicity falls apart once more. Because even though the signature of selection is clear, even though the spread of this variant has left its fossil in the genome, scientists still don't know, with certainty, which of its effects provided the main advantage. Was it something to do with thicker hair helping shed water or retain heat? Was it about teeth and diet? Was it about sweat glands uncooling in particular climates? Was it something about how the face, including the eyes, developed in children, perhaps changing how they coped with certain environments in childhood when survival is most precarious? Or was it some combination of all of these? A bundle of small benefits that, together, were enough to push the variant through entire populations. No one knows for sure. They can see the wave, but not the exact wind that drove it. And that is so often how it is. When you look closely at evolution, you can detect that a trait was favored, that it rose quickly, that it left its imprint. You can say, this mattered. This was not random, but the exact way in which it mattered, the precise advantage it gave out there on the steppe, or in the cold river valleys, or under the hazy, humid skies of that time, remains partly hidden, wrapped in the unknowable details of lives that left no written records, only bones and buried tools and the quiet code in our cells. So when people try to say epicanthic folds exist because of cold, or because of high minus altitude glare, or because of what people found attractive, they are each holding a part of the truth, but not the whole. The folds, the fat pads, the way the eyelids sit, the characteristic shapes we see in Eastern Central Asian populations and in other scattered groups around the world. These are the products of convergent evolution driven by many overlapping environmental pressures: cold, wind glare from snow and ice, burning ultraviolet light at high altitudes, and also by non-minus environmental forces, by drift, by preference, by cultural patterns of who paired with whom and whose features were passed down. They are synergy, not singularity. Think of your own eye shape, whatever it is, as the sum of thousands of small pushes and pulls. Perhaps they were ancestors who lived where the air was razor-minus dry and thin, with a sun that stabbed at their vision from above and below, reflecting off pale ground, and that children's children kept the narrower eyes that made the days a little less punishing. Perhaps there were ancestors who found certain faces comforting, the eyes their parents had, the eyes of the people who laughed with them, hunted with them, raised them, and without knowing it, they sought out those faces in their partners, having babies whose eyes carried that same familiar fold or tilt. Perhaps there were moments of pure chance, of a small band splitting from a larger group, a storm forcing people to take one path and not another, a river cutting a new channel, stranding a family in a valley, and the traits they happened to carry simply became the traits of that valley forever. All these layers now rest in the skin around your eyes. And here is a gentle, humbling truth, one that can ease some of the weight of self-minus consciousness that so many of us carry. When you look into a mirror and focus on a single feature, when you fixate on how your eyes look, or how your nose sits, or how your jaw is shaped, you are often seeing it through a very recent, very narrow lens, the beauty standards of your own culture, in your own brief moment in time. But the face itself, the architecture of it, is older than any of those standards. It is a record, a remnant, an archive of adaptation and survival, a story your ancestors wrote with their choices and their endurance, with the paths they walked and the storms they weathered. Human facial diversity, the sheer variety of eye shapes and nose bridges and cheekbones and lips on this planet, is not random decoration, and it is not a ranking of better and worse. It is the visible, living record of what it took for different branches of our shared family to persist in different corners of the world. Every wide, deep set gaze that evolved in hot, bright plains, every narrow, sheltered opening that evolved in snowfields and on ice, every high, flared cheekbone, every rounded, soft contour, all of them carry tales of climate and diet and disease and chance and culture layered into them. Your features and mine are proof that someone before us met a harsh world and survived long enough to pass something of themselves on. As you lie here, perhaps aware still of the weight of your own eyelids, the way the skin folds when they close, try to imagine, for a moment, the world as if every face you've ever seen were a kind of map. A map not of roads and cities, but of journeys through time. That person's eyes, angled just so, trace back to high plateaus where the wind never quite stopped, to tense humming with whispered stories as people sealed themselves against the cold. That person's soft, uncreased lids, paired with deeply pigmented irises, trace back to long, relentless summers, to blazing, vertical suns and shimmering horizons. That person's prominent cheekbones and thick, protective fat pads around the eyes trace back to deserts or tundra-s, where warmth had to be hoarded carefully within the body. That person's mixture of all these things, a little of one, a little of another, speaks of migrations unmixing, of lineages that met and merged, bringing together adaptations from distant lands in a single, new configuration. Your face, is one such map. Some of its roads run back through East or Central Asia, through glacial refuges and windswept plains. Some may trace toward Africand, the cradle where all our stories begin. Some may cross the mountains, or wander along coastal routes, or cut through forest belts. All of them converge, right now, in the way your skin sits over your skull, in the way light catches on the curve of your eyelid when you close your eyes, half-minus way. And the most beautiful part, the most freeing part, is that no one of these maps is the original. No one of these configurations is the correct human face. There is no default, no ideal shape that others deviate from. There is only variation, and each variation is a record of resilience. When you watch people on a busy street or scroll past faces on a screen, it is easy to forget this, easy to see only difference, only otherness, easy to let those ancient habitats and pressures blur into stereotypes or prejudices. But if you could see, superimposed over each brow and cheek and eye, the landscapes where those features took form, the storms that raged, the sunlight that poured down, the ice that crept in, the chance draws of genetic beads, the ancient loves and losses that decided whose eyes looked into whose, you might feel something softer instead. A kind of reverence. I sense that everyone you meet carries an epic inscribed in their flesh. And you, lying here now, with whatever feelings you may have had about your own reflection. Too much of this, not enough of that, too different, too ordinary, are the living endpoint of an unbroken chain of survivors. People whose bodies and choices and sheer persistence carried them through climate's wings and shortages and illnesses and migrations. People whose features, including the small details of how their eyelids folded and their eyes sat in their skulls, worked well enough, were lived enough, were simply lucky enough to be copied into the next generation, and the next, until they arrived, intact enough to be recognized in you. Even that EDA or variant, that tiny, mysterious tweak in the code, is part of this feeling. It's not an abstract piece of data in a report. It's a story of something that helped, somehow, in ways we can only guess at now, helped your distant kin stay alive and raise children. It swept through a population, not because it was superior in some grand moral sense, but because it tilted the odds just a little in favor of those who carried it. And now, thousands of generations later, it might be responsible for the thickness of your hair between your fingers, or the way your teeth feel when your tongue presses against them, or the way your eyelids crease when you smile. All of that, all of those connections are gently humming in the background of your life, whether you think about them or not. So as you hover here between waking and sleep, between conscious thought and drifting imagination, you can hold this one simple idea, that there is no single cause, no single story, behind the way any part of you looks. Instead, you are the sum of converging currents, cold winds and bright suns, random draws of genetic beads, silent spreads of powerful variants like EDA, a 370A, cultural tastes and loves and longings, all weaving together. When someone asks, why do these eyes look this way? The truest answer is, because many different forces, acting over deep time, all left their signatures there. And that complexity is not something to fear or to flatten into something simpler. It is something to rest in, to relax into. The same way you relax into a quilt knowing that every patch, every stitch, comes from a different moment, a different hand. You don't need to isolate one square and call it the real quilt. You don't need to pick one cause and call it the real reason. You can let them all coexist, layered and blended, just as they do in you. If the next time you see someone whose features are very different from your own, you feel that familiar jolt of noticing, that ancient human impulse to sort and categorize, perhaps a part of you will also remember this layered story. You might imagine the cold that rested in their ancestors' bones, or the heat that burned their ancestors' skin. You might imagine the particular paths their line walked, the particular variants that swept through their people, the particular preferences that shaped who found whom and who raised the next generation. And instead of seeing strangeness, you might see another version of being human, another way that our shared species has solved the problem of survival on a varied and often unforgiving planet. And when you look at yourself, perhaps tomorrow in the quiet light of morning, when your eyes are still a little heavy from sleep, when the lines and folds of your face are soft and unguarded, you might remember that you are not an error to be corrected or a standard to be measured against. You are a story. You are many stories, sedimented one on top of the other. Stories of ice and fire, of wind and stillness, of random chance and fierce intention. Stories that passed in whispers of DNA, through bodies that carried firewood and children and tools, through people who sang and fought and hoped and feared just as you do, until finally they settled into the particular configuration of bone and muscle and skin you feel when you touch your eyelids now. You can feel, perhaps, the weight of that, but not as a burden, more as a kind of deep belonging, a realization that however isolated or out of place you might sometimes feel in the machinery of modern life, your body itself is not alien. It is deeply, thoroughly of this earth, of this history, a culmination of strategies that worked well enough to last. Your eyes, closing now, have been prepared for you not just by your parents and grandparents, but by thousands of nameless ancestors whose cells divided faithfully, whose genes shuffled and recombined, whose mutations rose and fell like waves, until against the endless backdrop of deep time, you appeared, a particular, once minus only arrangement of every force we've been tracing. Let that thought cradle you for a moment. The idea that, as your day ends and your perception narrows down to this darkened room and the soft rise and fall of your breath, you are also, in another sense, as wide as the history of our species. Inside you are the echoes of glacial winds, the glare of ancient suns, the contingencies of migrations, the quiet power of selection. And whether your eyelids carry a pronounced fold, or a faint one, or none at all, whether your eyes are framed by thick pads of fat or by fine, delicate skin, those details are all part of how your lineage found ways to keep seeing, to keep finding shelter, to keep moving forward. So you can let go a little more. You don't need to hold on to every explanation, every term, every gene name. You don't need to remember which force did what in which epoch. You only need to remember that you belong to this vast, intertwined story, that your face, with all its particularities, is not a puzzle to solve, but an outcome to accept, a testament to survival. Your eyelids, now, do what eyelids have done for countless generations. They lower slowly, perhaps flutter once or twice. They cover the windows that have been open to light and detail and effort all day, and behind them, the tiny muscles and tissues that give your eyes their shape relax, released for a while from the constant work of focus and expression. Around you, the modern world hums or quiets, depending on where you are. But inside you, the older rhythms take over. The slow pulse of blood, the tidal rise and fall of your breath, the way your thoughts lengthen and blur as your brain slips into the patterns of sleep that sustained your ancestors in caves and huts and tents and homes, built from stone and wood and later brick and steel. Every one of them lay down at the end of their days and closed eyes, shaped by the same blend of forces you carry now. They closed them against sparks from open fires, against the glint of starlight on snow, against the faint glow of early hearths and later candles and much later electric bulbs. And as they drifted, the folds and creases of their lids, the way their lashes touched their cheeks, all of that made no difference to the simple fact that they were resting, that their bodies were taking a necessary pause in the long work of staying alive. You are doing the same, continuing something unimaginably ancient, continuing it in a body that tells, in its quiet details, how that continuity was achieved. So let your eyes rest now, without judgment, without analysis. Let them be what they are, the products of convergent evolution, of overlapping pressures, of genes like EDA, a 370A sweeping through populations and leaving their mark, of drift and love and culture and chance. Let your face be what it is, an unrepeatable outcome of human flexibility, and let your mind drift, as their minds drifted, away from ice and wind and glare into the softer weather of dreams, where the landscapes you walk may be very different, where the dangers and comforts are made of memory and imagination rather than climate and scarcity, but where, somewhere deep down, the same old story continues. A human being, closing their eyes, carried by the lineage of survivors who came before them, resting now so that, when light returns, they can open those eyes again and see whatever tomorrow has laid before them. And as you lie here, somewhere between waking and sleep, you might notice how this story wraps back around to its beginning, how the smallest details of your face are connected to the grandest forces you can imagine. Ice and sunlight, thin air and blinding snow, dry winds that cracked lips and stung eyes, times when every tiny advantage in keeping vision clear and skin protected could ripple through generations. And how, layered on top of all of that, are the quieter, subtler forces, the ones that don't show up in blizzards or dust storms, but in glances and preferences, and the slow drift of who chooses whom. A world where, long after the hardest ice has melted, people are still carrying the echoes of those ancient pressures in what they find familiar, in what they find beautiful, in what makes them think, yes, this person feels like home. Here's the thing, your body is not a single answer to a single question. It's more like a set of sliders on a character creator screen, nudged this way and that over thousands of generations, sometimes by fierce necessity, sometimes by fiats, sometimes by chance, sometimes by affection, sometimes by nothing more than who happened to be nearby when two people decided to share their lives. Eye-opening, a little narrower here, a fold a little deeper there, cheekbones a little higher or lower, fat padding a little thicker around the orbit, each change small on its own. Over deep time, amounting to a recognizable pattern, a familiar kind of face. And some of those patterns, the ones that protect the eyes by narrowing the opening and dadding a fold of skin, have appeared more than once, in more than one place, in people whose lineages have been apart for a long time. That's convergent evolution written in flesh rather than in textbooks. Different branches of the human family, walking different paths across the earth, encountering similar harshness, similar glare, similar wind, and arriving, by different genetic routes, at shapes that solve similar problems, not because they shared a recent common ancestor with that exact look, but because the environment asked the same question in multiple regions, and this, again and again, was one of the answers that worked. If you carry that kind of fold over your eyes, or if you don't, either way, your face is part of that tapestry of repeated solutions and unique outcomes. And somewhere in that tapestry runs the thread of certain genes, like that variant in EDAR, sweeping through one region with surprising strength, changing not just one feature but several, hair and teeth and glands and eyelids, a single tweak with many visible echoes. We can see its fingerprint in the present, we can trace its spread, we can tell that it must have mattered, must have helped in some way, but we still do not know with complete certainty whether the main push was shelter from climate or some advantage in nursing infants, or something else that left no obvious mark, but survival itself. The story is clear in outline and blurred in detail, like a face seen through frost on glass, recognizable, but not fully resolved. And that's all right, because part of what makes this nightly reflection soothing, part of what makes it human, is accepting that some pieces of our own history are misted over, that even in an age of genomes and data, there are still quiet mysteries in the way we came to look as we do. You right now are lying at the far end of that river, and the river is still flowing. Mutations will still occur. Pressures will still shift, preferences will still rise and fall, and someday, far beyond your lifetime, faces may settle into patterns that feel as distant from your own as you feel from those who stared out across frozen steppes at the height of glacial winters. Have you ever seen a newborn's face, round and soft and still a little swollen from the work of being born? The eyes, not quite open, the lids puffed and folded in a way that often smooths out as the child grows. All human infants carry, for a little while, that extra fold over the eye, that gentle curtain of skin. In many, it recedes, becomes subtle or vanishes as the bones and tissues shift. In others, it lingers, becomes one of the enduring signatures of that face, a small echo of a universal starting point that their lineage chose to keep. And there is something tender in that, isn't there? The idea that we all begin with this shared blueprint, that variation is, in a sense, a choice made in the unfolding of growth, guided by the quiet instructions written in our DNA, instructions themselves shaped by ice ages and altitudes and ancestries we'll never fully name. So when you think about your own eyes, whether you have spent time judging them, wishing them larger or smaller, wishing the crease were different, wishing the fold were or less pronounced, you might let another thought in alongside those old habits. The thought that what you see in the mirror is not a mistake, not something that should have turned out some other way, but the current version of a design that has been field minus tested in deserts and forests, on coasts and plateaus, through droughts and famines and storms. The current version of a design that has passed through countless sieves of survival and chance and affection. Your ancestors squinted into blizzards, or into dust carried by dry winds, or into the reflections of a high, bright sun on snow or water. They shielded their eyes with hands and hoods and, eventually, with built shelters. But before any of that, their first line of defense was their own skin, their own lashes, their own folds and angles. And, over glacial millennia, the people who happened to carry small advantages in those moments were the ones more likely to raise children to adulthood, the ones more likely to pass along the variants that molded the lids and brows you carry now. Even the parts of the story that came from pure chance, from genetic drift and founder effects, when small groups moved on unsettled in new lands, even those are part of a deeper pattern. Because chance is not the opposite of meaning here. It is one of the ways that diversity arises, one of the ways that new combinations appear, some of which will later prove crucial, some of which will simply persist because they do no harm and there is no reason for them to fade. And so your features carry both the marks of necessity and the traces of happenstance, both the signatures of selection and the footprints of long minus ago coincidences. As your breathing evens out, as your body sinks a little deeper into whatever supports you, you can let all of this complexity soften into a single, simple feeling, a feeling of being held in time by a line that stretches back to icy plains and high plateaus, to humid forests and wide grasslands, to nights under stars that seemed closer because there were no cities to blur them, a feeling of being exactly what you were meant to be in this moment, in this life, a descendant of people who adapted and endured and in the quiet darkness at the end of each day closed their eyes just as you are closing yours now.